So I had been wondering what my archive was about, and I didn't really understand until I laid really the last stone. Um, this here is a picture, 1938. It's a wire photo of Babe Ruth, who was then very briefly for 1 year. He was a coach, I believe, a first base coach for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And during this period of time, he would actually participate in these kind of exhibition matches or exhibition moments in these little contests, like a slugging contest, so to speak, before games. And he would still hit these mammoth home runs. Um, at this point, uh, let me see. At this point, he was 43. So he'd been out of the game since that period with the Boston Braves in 1935, and he would die 10 years after this 1 year with the Brooklyn Dodgers as a first base coach. Um, I had to ask myself, because there are some ways in which this archive is about the political revolutionary qualities of baseball, which is something that I think is important, especially as it pertains to Cuba, in terms of political liberatory possibilities through the vehicle of culture. That's one aspect of it. But there's a deeper existential aspect hidden within that question, and I had to ask myself. There's four essential nodes. There's the node of Roger Maris and the chase for 61, which was a huge node. There's the node of Jackie Robinson's integration and his years with the Brooklyn Dodgers, which was another huge node. There's the node of Satchel Paige and his later career, specifically in the 60s into the 1970s, which forms the epilogue, so to speak, of the archival story, the mythic story. And then there is this node of Babe Ruth, which is something that I haven't really touched on at all in these essays or this conversation or this dialogue. But I saw this piece, and I started to understand at a deeper level the existential power and question at work, specifically as it pertains to, I don't know how to put this, the will as an aperture that's revealed through the sport of baseball. So the way that I would kind of couch that is to say that with all four of those figures, right? Again, the archive, the modern archive, really begins and situates itself with Cuba and the rise of a political and cultural revolution through the vehicle of baseball, and the culture of baseball in Cuba as a way of constituting early national identity in the midst of the war against the Spanish colonial government. But then the archive shifts lenses as we head into the 1900s, and I think there is more of an existential philosophical dilemma that the archive is working with, particularly as it pertains to time, force, energy, and space. And so then it really does open up into this square, or this four-pointed movement that really is sprung by Ruth in the early 1920s with the onset of his power hitting ability. I touch on the 1916 World Series a bit, but it's primarily around the early 1920s matchups against the New York Giants, then into 1927. And then there is this piece here, which is 1938, this kind of exhibition pre-game home run style event that fans are gathering to see Ruth take his last swings. And then there's that final event in 1942, which is a relief fund exhibition between him and a then aging Walter Johnson in this final moments of this collision. of these two mythic all-time greats, right? These two absolute inner circle Hall of Famers, one last time on the baseball diamond for this war relief effort. There's Ruth, which then, of course, that naturally progresses from 42 into Jackie Robinson's integration, 47 to 55 and 56. And there's several different aspects that are touched on there, different artifacts and documents. And then from there, it goes to Maris's chase. It really does zero in on 1961, and then the fallout of that chase in terms of the force of will and presence of will and presence of mind that's exerted by Maris to accomplish this mythic feat, which again is to break the most cherished and valued record in baseball history as an outsider to the New York Yankees, as a New York Yankee, right? Again, this most cherished, legendary figure, the greatest record in baseball, the single season home run record. And then just after Maris, there's this epilogue, which is the end of Satchel Paige's career, his last barnstorming rides, his Kansas City Athletics appearances in 1965, and then his induction into the Hall of Fame in 1971, and the archive ends. What this is talking about in so many different ways, and why I find this particular image of Ruth to be more powerful really than anything. You could say 1927 or Babe Ruth as a pitcher in the 19-teens. I do like those images as well, right? Especially the onset of his career. But really, we're talking about both with Robinson's integration, which again is different than his time with the Kansas City Monarchs. We're talking about Maris in 1961, and then the fallout of that, 62, 63, his final years with the Yankees before he moves on to the Cardinals. Satchel Paige, the very end of his career, where he finally becomes canonized really as a baseball saint, so to speak, the greatest pitcher of all time in so many words, in so many ways. And this period of Ruth's career, right, which is to say it's post his career, really. The 1935 images with the Boston Braves, 38 with the Dodgers, and then 42 with the relief game, is that we're looking at these feats of will, these I would say these feats of spiritual passion in participation with the game and sport of baseball, where this was discussed a little bit, a fair bit actually, in a prior essay, is that Ruth's identity itself is around baseball and constituted by baseball, and in so many ways he constitutes America's cultural identity through this mythic merging of the force of his life and his existence, the so often quoted larger than life persona of Babe Ruth, and all of the deep trauma and wounding and loss and violation in his early childhood life. Right, so much of Babe Ruth's story, just as much as it is the story of America and the story of baseball, in its greatest figures, are stories of trauma, alienation, isolation, slavery, violence, rupture. Right, and from these ruptures and from these fragmentations spring the mythic presences that themselves become the legends of the game, or the essential immortal fabrics which are gestured towards to this day as the superstructure of baseball itself, the icons and the memories of baseball history, and its most powerful moments, where it not only became an indelible part of the fabric of American culture and American history, but spoke deeply to something existentially true about humanity and human life, and not only humanity and human life, but existence itself in a metaphysical sense. So when we look at a photo like this, the most apt comparison to me is Satchel Paige's agelessness, right? It's his perennial attempt to return to the game, and often successfully, very successfully, to continue to achieve and perform and experience this unity with the sport and the game of baseball, and through the craft of pitching, which is something that he cultivates as a very young child, and finds this natural proclivity in throwing rocks. It's actually a way that he protects himself as a young child, and in the early American South as a poor black child who's effectively stateless, in the sense that he doesn't exist on the census, his family name changes, etc. This is very similar, I think, archetypally to the way that Ruth constructs himself at St. Mary's the reformatory, I believe is what you would call it, where he's undergoing this profound, and Satchel Paige also goes to a school for troubled black children, which is informed philosophically and culturally by Booker T. Washington, interestingly enough. Ruth's essence, his identity, the locus of his being, right? The force of his will, it's not found in his familial relationship. It's not found in his marital relationship. It's not found in the public sphere. It's not something that he finds through the various different forms of indulgences that he participates in, whether it's partying or gluttony with food. The locus of his will, it's something that is almost spiritually stewarded and dedicated as in a spiritual passion towards the game of baseball. And what's interesting to me about Ruth along with Paige, and we'll get to Maris and we'll get to Robinson in this sense, is that the force of the identity or the locus of the personality is so consecrated and established and founded in the game itself that there is a sort of primordial unity of identity. And we see this in terms of both Paige and Ruth's legend in the game. It's an indelible mark that is made from a total dedication of passion. And so again, when I think about this, I think about spiritual aspiration or sainthood, or the idea or the concept of a monk. And this is something that's, to me, is so closely allied to the way in which Ruth and Paige experience the game, but also how we experience Ruth and Paige through the game of baseball, through the aperture of baseball, and through the history of baseball, as these figures who, as you can see here, Ruth has clearly aged, and his swing looks almost just as awkward and effortless as it ever did. And this home run that's being remarked upon here was 435 feet in Sportsman's Park in St. Louis. This is a man who has perfected the craft and the technique and is participating in this cosmic artistry of the physical act of hitting a baseball, which is so often considered one of the hardest things to do, if not the hardest thing to do in all of sports, and all of physical or athletic achievement, in terms of the presence of mind and presence of body, the reaction time necessary, and the ability to read and understand and interpret information by the millisecond, and to react to it with a very fluent architecture and archaeology of the body, the muscle memory required to respond to that incoming impulse, that incoming sensory information. All of that is to say that when we look at Ruth, not just so much in the pop cultural referential way of the home run king or the guy who brought power to baseball. I'm talking more about Ruth as this man whose entire identity is subsumed in the game and the passion of baseball. And you see him in 35, 38, and then again in 42, go on these series of last rides, which to me are symbolic of the power of the will in the face of the entropic decline of the human form, which themselves are a testament to the passion, which again is the spiritual force of will behind the apparent phenomenological movement and force of baseball itself, where again, participation in the act of baseball is an inherently aesthetic act. It's not something that is dedicated toward the typical drives of the human being or the animal or the organism toward the perpetuation of survival or a reproductive drive, for instance. This is a passion that has been subsumed, and the metabolic structure of the organism, it's almost like there's been a transference or transformation of the essential identity of the organism into a spiritual identification with this high aesthetic craft, this practice, this technique. And so you see this transformation of identity, which is common to both Ruth and Paige, which is that their life is within baseball. They've almost ceased to become citizens of this evolutionary biological organism, which you would call the human species, and they've entered into this monk-like devotional relationship with the fundamental energetic force and power and thrust of existence itself, which you would just simply call the essential will, the dormant, latent will of the cosmos beneath and before biology. And this cultural ritual or this cultural rite of baseball has allowed them to enter into that. And as such, they have entered into the realm and the dimension of the mythic or the legendary. And then the cultural ritual architecture of baseball and American history and American culture, as essentially intertwined with baseball, responds to that with canonization, which again is why the archive ends with Satchel Paige's Hall of Fame induction. This is a canonization of a black man, and even as he's canonized, he's put in a separate wing for Negro Leagues players, and he expresses his frustration at this very clearly. But to connect this with the ancillary but no less important other two figures in this quadratic equation, so to speak, are with Robinson and Maris. The force of Robinson is a boundary-breaking integrative thrust, which is again an expression of primordial will, revolutionary will, through the cultural aperture of baseball to revolutionize that aperture. Similar to the way that Page invents his pitches or Ruth revolutionizes the home run swing or power hitting in baseball, which then becomes the spectacle or the theater of baseball headed into its golden age. We again are talking about a devotional force and thrust of will through the cultural aperture and apparatus and theater of baseball, which is symbolic. It's representational, which again is essential to culture and the meaning and reason and power and existential force behind culture, is that it's a representational devotional act which symbolizes a underlying or dormant necessary psychic revolution or evolution that needs to occur in the larger, more fundamental political framework of the culture or the civilization or the species at large. It's a symbolic act, a symbolic revolutionary act of the spirit or of the soul or of the self, much in the way that you could describe Nietzsche's philosophy as a spiritual symbolic act of leaping into a new version of humanity, right? A version of humanity which is no longer human. It's become something ulterior, as in a transformation of the man, of the human and of the man. This expression is the fundamental expression of the universal will to gesture to something beyond the current existing cultural, political, social conditions of humanity by way of a boundary-breaking symbolic representational act in the theater of culture, which then forces an ontological shift in the breach of humanity itself and forces a conscious recognition, an expansion of and with the powers that be in this reckoning, which is to say Jackie Robinson, a black man integrating America's foremost cultural artifact on the theatrical stage of its existence. It's Jackie Robinson stepping into and onto the stage of how to express it. Black political inclusion in the utter foundation and fabric and framework of American culture and civilization as an equal, as one of the Brooklyn Nine, one of the most important teams in American history. Not just for Robinson's integration, but for its importance in the capital of American history and baseball history, which is to say New York City, especially during the 1950s. So you have that with Robinson. Then you also have Maris, especially the relationship of Maris to Ruth, which in itself is fascinating because, again, this conceivably a Yankee breaking the greatest Yankee of all time's record should be something that's celebrated, right? But instead, at every turn, he is fought back against by his very own fans, his very own home team and home base. So he's facing this paradoxical, contradictory. No one wants him to break this most hallowed record of 60 home runs in a single season. But you see this, it's almost like Maris ages 50 years in the span of a couple of months, while he and Mickey Mantle go back and forth. Mantle gets injured a little later on in the season, and Maris pulls definitively ahead and finishes with the home run record. You can see this ontological tension at the fabric and the foundation of baseball, much like Robinson, but in a more existential sense with Maris, less of a political, cultural, and racial sense with Robinson. The existential ontological tension of this, the most hollowed record, the most hollowed historical mark in all of baseball history, that is symbolic of the legacy of who is considered to be the most beloved Yankee of all time and the most important figure in baseball of all time at that point, than Babe Ruth. For Maris to attempt to break that in Ruth's old uniform, in Ruth's old stadium, while all of the fans in the community of the Yankees are rooting against him to break this record. To do so as the tension increasingly game after game, as he inches closer and closer, ratcheting up in the extremity of approaching this landmark, which no one considered or thought then to really be approached or approachable. Hank Greenberg and Jimmy Fox came close to it in the 1930s at one point, but this was not considered to be a record that would be broken. And the experience that Maris has psychologically in and through this process is, again, this force of will, which in all of these instances, this is not necessarily about victory. This is not about Ruth becoming the champion of the home run hitters. This is not about Page becoming the greatest pitcher of all time. This is not about Robinson achieving some sort of cultural victory, although it is in many ways, right, in the sense of responsibility that he clearly articulates to the Black community at large. Nor is it actually about Maris breaking this home run record. This is about something deeper. This is about the expression of the primordial will, the essence of the primordial will emerging through cultural rite and making itself clear and apparent phenomenologically through this cultural rite. And it's the intercession and occlusion of myth and legend into the world of the real, into the space of the real. So much as you would say that, I use the word occlusion to speak of something like the eclipse of the sun. It's the moment where a ulterior reality intercedes upon the everyday and makes apparent something deeper, more dormant, more fundamental into the world of the real. It's the apparatus of realization of the deeper substratum of existence itself proper. And so when we're talking about this, we're talking about the Avataric emergence in baseball history. So we're really actually tracing the Avataric emergence of existential reality through the aperture and lens of the everyday human, and baseball itself being a stadium, a social, cultural, and political rite that makes these grounds fertile, possible, available through its architecture, through its superstructure. And then through the participation in that superstructure, the readily available rules, regulations, conditions, uniforms, diamonds, stadiums, the sedimentary development of its legends and its history, which then are played upon, such as with Maris or Robinson's breaking of the color barrier, which didn't actually exist until later in the 1800s. There were Black baseball players in professional baseball. They were not well tolerated or well liked at all, but they did exist, such as Fleet Walker and Bud Fowler. This is a cultural theater which is presenting the fertile architectural conditions for the possibility of the supraordinate or the super real, or even in a Nietzschean sense, the Übermenschen, to emerge out from under the framework and the underpinnings of humanity by way of utilization of the metabolic architecture, of the biochemical and hormonal architecture of the organism. You see, this is a framework of life which exists in a purely natural, as I would call it, the way of natura, that it would that it exists in this purely natural, kind of fertile, physically present, and enveloped in the subconscious ecosystemic life of this greater universal organism. That is, it's a sort of fertile and lush garden or field in which the brain is actually being grown in evolutionary conditions through the recombination of biology, genetics, chemicals, and the network, the neural networks and architecture of the nervous system of the organism. Right, this is a process of this this kind of fattening in the uterine architecture of the cosmos and space and time itself in a universal sense. This is a sort of awaiting, a gesturing midnight, which is seeking to find day, as in the utilization of these dormant, latent powers towards creative emergence of the expression and realization of the essential creative powers of the universe itself. So again, this is a utilization of the will through this dormant primordial fabric and framework of existence itself, even in terms of the steel undergirdings of a stadium, or the grass and dirt of a baseball field, or the wool of a baseball uniform. Right? These are all different ways of repurposing through technique, through prosthetic rearrangement of the elemental and chemical terms and conditions of existence itself, to create a vast, complex, interdisciplinary cultural fabric through which to express something which is simultaneously essential to nature and the cosmos and the universal order, which is the will itself, through something that is unnatural, right? In the sense that it's a repurposing of nature through architecture, through architectonics, to realize the essential hid within the natural, to realize the essential hid within the jungle of consciousness, so to speak, or the jungle of the real. This kind of foreboding, forbidding ancient ancestral history, which has been evolutionarily progressing for hundreds of thousands and millions of years, to the point of which it can be realized, harnessed, incorporated into this incredibly rich, fertile cultural mythology, which takes that essential evolutionary energy, that essential packaged and packeted will within the literal latent genetic constructs of humanity, access it, realize it, and direct it towards this high aesthetic art of the total realization of the spiritual self and the spiritual soul in space and in time. And when we look at baseball history, there are several different figures who just so deeply symbolize this, because they are the avataric presence in baseball. And so when I say avatar, I'm saying Buddha or Krishna or Christ or Muhammad. They are the prophets or the realizations of a substratic consciousness, evolutionary potential, which is latent within humanity, but they're realizing it through the architecture of humanity, pulling it out into expression and holding it out and saying, here is the real, and here is the real beyond the phenomenological appearance of the real, right? And that's what's so critical, and this is what's so important about baseball and baseball history, is that, see how I can say this. This is a realization of the real, not in the method of prophecy or prophet, in the sense that there is this individual, this latent evolutionary genius, or this avatar, this metaphysician who is presenting these universal cosmological truths in the form of a parable, or in the form of a religious sect, or a unified field, or a cosmology. It's that the architecture and the cultural history of baseball as a demos, right, as a democratic participation, as a theater, a revolutionary theater, and a device of this expression, is that it makes clear and it reveals the essential force of the will as a, like, really an extraterrestrial phenomena, which again is precisely the captivation and the metaphysical spectacle of baseball. Through the clothes, the garments, the rituals, the devices which humanity is weaving like a twine to make this expressible through the physical act of baseball, whether that's pitching, hitting, fielding, catching, a home run. And so when you have these mythical states as such as the captivation of a figure like Babe Ruth, who effectively in so many ways invents the home run as we know it in modern terms today, you're witnessing the emergence of this revolutionary technological device as a revelation, as a way of saying, here is the essence of the will, as in this emergence of a new form of power, or a new way of being through this existential cultural striving of this organism, who we are calling Babe Ruth, who revolutionizes the cultural device of baseball in this new way of being. Again, Jackie Robinson, this is the same principle, right? Satchel Paige, the same principle, with his pitching and his styles of pitching and his way of telling the story of baseball. Roger Maris as well, right? He's interacting with this antecedent in baseball history, this figure, this avataric figure of Babe Ruth, and there is a discourse going on. This is a historical phenomenon unfolding. There's a dialectical tension between the foundational mythology of the golden age of baseball and this challenger who emerges from within to don the clothes of the greatest record of all time within the house and the cultural mythology in which that was created. So you see these archetypal dynamics. The black man who really 15 years before the civil rights movement gains much power or thrust or force within American politics at large, steps onto the baseball diamond and not only proves himself to be an equal in a cultural civilizational sense in American history, but proves himself to be one of the best, if not the best players on the diamond for the years that he remains to play in the professional leagues, American professional leagues with the Brooklyn Dodgers. So when you have figures, I think again like Babe Ruth or Paige, Babe Ruth being this deeply troubled foster child who enters into St. Mary's as kind of this reformatory academy, learns how to play baseball with one of the Jesuit fathers, and he's just kind of trained in this craft, and he just increasingly devotes himself to this practice and becomes more and more and more indelibly a part of it, and it a part of him. And there is this spiritual aspirational quality of realization that occurs again from the most mote, the most humble, the most desolate or misfortune, this youth who was essentially lost to time and lost to history in Baltimore, Maryland, and who goes on to become the most important pop cultural figure in baseball history. And even as he does so, there is this force of will being expressed through him to the point of which I think it overwhelms him. As you can see that as it occurs in his life, he's dealing with this intense weight of this early childhood trauma, just as much as he is dealing with these increased pressures of fame and fortune. This is effectively a young boy who is catapulted and rocketed into pop cultural fame, social fame, for his really devotional skill and ability on the baseball diamond. And the force of his will, to me with Ruth, I think this is something that's different than Robinson or Paige or Maris, because I think Ruth becomes a transpersonal figure in the sense that the will that is being expressed through him overwhelms or is necessarily beyond him. And I think he's struggling to grapple with the entirety of the force of that will, especially through his appetites. This is someone who never fully becomes assimilated into the everyday mechanism of cultural life. someone who almost seems destined for this liminal territory of archetypal figure who expresses this American political civilizational force and might, which is to say, I mean, the power of a home run. Again, this is a literal force of will if you were going to gesture towards it purely in scientific terms. This is phenomenological. This is something that can actually be measured. This revolution of Ruth in and through baseball, I think in so many ways is the cultural representation of American modern industrial power, which itself is a revolutionary form and way of being historically, being reflected and mirrored through the cultural apparatus of baseball. And Ruth is the avatar that is delivering this phenomenological representation. And to stay with him in particular, is to consider the outsized metaphysical force of will that's moving through him. Again, if you look at his biography, his family life, his personal life, it's a radical force that's moving through him that's being expressed on physical phenomenological terms through the power of hitting a baseball. Again, 435 feet at the age of almost 50 here. It's a force that's being expressed through him, which is never fully assimilated into being human in terms of how we conceive it in a modern context, in terms of cultural life, social life, political life, domestic life. These are things that never really achieve true ground and footing in Ruth, in the being of Ruth. He's attempting to fit this outsized power and force and nature of will into the human form in a human cultural societal sense, I think pretty consistently, and you can see his frustration at the attempts to do so. But you see it most clearly here, and this is why, again, I think he continues to return to the diamond, and the American culture at large seeks to see him participate in and on the diamond, because what he is showing something that's superordinate, right? Something that's superhuman. He is showing this superhuman capacity and force of will, which is being ontologically actually presented and shown and depicted. He's bringing something into the field to express it. And I think that's what's so powerful about him as a figure. Because again, it's a cultural representation, right? A cultural representation of the dominant mass political social thrust of this power drive that is rising through industrialization, globalization, and modernization. Which, again, this is something that's being realized in and through America and around the world to various different degrees, but particularly through America. And what Ruth is doing is he's giving a cultural phenomenological language through the apparatus of his physical body to this rising of this larger, massive, collective phenomenon, which is occurring and is being realized in the field of consciousness itself, which is to say the ecosystem of the species field of humanity. from everything to the skyscrapers in New York City, which again, I don't think it's any coincidence that Ruth is located there as the main power center, media center, cultural center, um, economic empire of America at this period of time. From the skyscrapers to the factories to the building of cities, whether that's London, what have you. So to not get too drawn into that aspect of this is to say that when you have this avataric presence of Ruth, right, you have someone who's, again, this is kind of a superhuman heroic figure who is participating in this cultural artifact of baseball. And through the cultural artifact of baseball, again, this is the critical aspect of this, he's realizing a potential of the will, which again is superhuman or suprahuman in the sense that it is beyond human. He's bringing it into the field of humanity to be expressed, witnessed, observed phenomenologically as a gesture into and toward the beyond of the current existing metaphysical order and status of the species at large. So to have a figure like this and to relate him back to Maris and Robinson and Page is to say that we have these figures of forces of will manifest on the cultural stage. This is not a myth. This is not a theater. This is the creation of a theatrical architecture in which to express humanity directly, but it's not a symbolism. These are, again, real lives, who are expressing through the aperture of, again, limited biological organismic humanity, which has an entropic date and time stamp on it, which is working with musculature, which is working with organs, which is working with veins and nervous system, synapses and senses, working within this framework, an entire natural order which has been reconstructed and reconfigured through culture. Again, the development of a stadium, the development of the rules of baseball, the equipment, the uniforms, the bats, the balls, the gloves, as you can see in this picture, the stands, the lights, all of these different ways that nature has been reorganized to make possible for this field of supraordinate presentation and representation of the force of the will, the essential will, emergent out from under and from within this latent humanity, and to express the extraterrestrial, the superhuman, to express this quality of the will, which is the plutonic transformative essence of existence, the underpinnings of all life, and to make this visible and apparent, as in an apparition, as in a manifestation or revelation of this force of will in real life as a rupture from everyday life, which again, it's a movement from within humanity into a revolutionary, evolutionary perception of the will itself and a realization of that. But there needs to be the one who holds the stone, so to speak, or the one who moves the stone or moves the rock, which again would be Sisyphus or Atlas, insert your mythological figure here, or Hercules. There needs to be the figure who performs this act, who brings this elemental existential life force into being and represents it teleologically as a whole thing, as something that is simultaneously encompassing of humanity, inclusive of humanity, and beyond it and above it, as in elemental, supraordinate, existentially total. And that is really it, I think. So when you see that force of Ruth here being almost 50 years old, hitting another 440-foot home run, we're talking about this force of will that is within him, that is manifest and emergent from him in the devotional aspirant quality of being this person whose entire life is devoted to baseball, from these early days in his childhood in the St. Mary's Reformatory as a foster child. This stateless man who has entered into this metaphysical relationship with the sport and practice and discipline of baseball, and through that sport, practice, and discipline of baseball, has realized this essential phenomenological representation of the force of will, which is extraterrestrial in the sense that it is the power behind humanity, behind reproduction, behind consumption, behind metabolism, behind entropy, behind the appearance of the human, behind the evolution of the human, behind the genetic code of the human. The force of the will itself in the universal cosmological whole, realizing it through the body, and as such, making it present, making it representational, making it physical, making it embodied, and making it then thus realizable at the level of the demos, right? At the level of the democratic perception of the ontological real, which is the purpose of the stadium, which is the purpose of the metaphysical act of baseball. To not only realize it within oneself, but to make it existentially, iconically visible to the world. And as such, to reveal the essential truth, the language of truth, to speak the language of truth. Even here without words in so many ways. Because this image itself is the language of truth that is unspoken, but it is present. And that's the key. So thank you very much. That's what I got for this one.